Okay, once again, we are here at the place. I'm going to be a little bit stiff. I've been having some back problems, and my spine is putting my neck out of shape, and so I'm a bit pale, and yet I have to put something around my neck to stretch it a bit. And so, hello, Bob.
Well, hello. It's good to be back here, and I've been working in my studio here, getting a few other things set up. So I got a new monitor behind me here, which is something I've been hooking up and working on, and other things. So having fun.
Yeah, I do like that. I do like that. Hello, Darryl.
Hello, I like your new look. You look sharp. You're, but I don't know how you are that still. I can never sit that still. I would be just about to explode if I had to sit there that still. But you
Yeah,
look good.
yeah. You think that I look good? Yeah, it's my new look. Nothing fit except for just drapery. So we're going to do it this way tonight.
It's
But
not a
I'm
bad
back in the
headshot.
control. I beg your pardon.
I said it's not a bad headshot. You know.
Okay, let's chat a bit. We were talking the other day. I'm trying to think about what the subject was, Bob, but you had stated some things, and can you refresh my mind as to what that was?
Oh my, we've talked about a lot of different things, and we do. One of the things I was talking about was depression.
Yes, go
Was that
for it.
what you were talking about?
Yeah,
Oh, well,
do
much to
me
the.
do me a favor before you start explaining, because I want you to read. You can find that really
Oh,
quick.
you want me to find
That
what
is
I
on your
wrote written
website.
on that, huh?
Read that, because that was really a compelling thing. So many people think that depression is X when
Well,
Bob Graves
well,
is saying
there
this
were a
might
lot of
be
people
something
also
different.
didn't like it at all. But let me look at it if I can read it here. Let's see if I can find it here. Okay. And I would have rewritten it a little differently now that I know the way some people misunderstood some of it. But anyway, I said, depression, is it a chemical imbalance? And I said, then, well, the question is quite deceitful. Everything that goes on in the brain is electrochemical. Thinking, remembering, speaking, seeing, wondering, being happy. The brain uses chemistry and electrical discharges for everything it does. Uh, it, Let me just add to this. Therefore, I don't believe that the electrochemical activity in the brain causes your thoughts. They are your thoughts. They are your experience. Your conscious awareness of them is the experience of them, but it's the experience of those electrochemical activities as they occur in the brain. So I don't believe they cause it. I believe they are it. Anyway, and then some people thought I was denying that there was electrochemical activity connected and associated with depression. I'm just saying no, it is the depression. When you see a beautiful sunset and it is awe-inspiring, your brain is engaged in the electrochemical process that enables your experience of seeing, interpreting, and eliciting the awe. If you, and then I gave an analogy here. If you drive to work today, the vehicle will get you there. Yes, that is true. But it is your decision to go, your ability to drive, and your sense of responsibility that leads you to the use of the vehicle. There is a sense in which the vehicle causes you to arrive at work, but we both know that this is not why you arrive at work. This is only how. Electrochemical activity in the brain is how you experience depression. It precipitates the experience, but it is the context of the circumstances of your life interacting with the perception of meaning. You infer from those circumstances as to what they say about you that determine why you are depressed and why your brain is engaged in its specific biochemical processes. Yes, a pill can help temporarily. It really can. And therapy can help you evaluate your perspective. But the cure is to first find a way to change what you infer your past or present circumstances say about you. A change in your circumstances may or may not be needed, And for most people, what you infer is a deeply entrenched habit, hard to break. This is not to deny horrible circumstances. Sometimes depression is the healthy and appropriate response. Most highly depressed people came through terrible abuse earlier in life, and I'm so sorry. Such things should never have happened to you. But if you consciously or unconsciously still think um, that abuse says something about your value or your lot in life, you need to find a way to break that habit. And you know, one of the things that I find interesting is this: if you could take a vacation down to, say, the Bahamas, sit on the beach with a bunch of people who at least possess the wherewithal and the assets and the opportunity to actually engage in a vacation down there and enjoy what it's like there. And some of them might talk to you. They might actually share with you their life story, and you'd hear a lot of common themes about how these people were very determined, very productive, very wealthy, very successful, la di da di da, and all that other stuff. Um, but you know what? If you go to a rehab clinic where people are either deeply depressed or addicted, and you listen to their stories, and they talk to you, and they tell you their life stories, um, are you going to tell me there's not going to be an appreciable difference between these people and their life stories? And how we can find people who are depressed and know, and it's true, that there is this electrochemical condition that is in their brain that can be somewhat manipulated a little bit with psychotropic drugs. But you're going to tell me that, oh, the only reason why they're depressed is just a chemical imbalance. It has absolutely nothing to do with what they've been through. Well, you know, like I said, that electrochemical activity in the brain does induce the experience. But you know, on my computer, I have a word processor. Now, on one level, it's absolutely true that everything my computer does is the result of the manipulations of bits of information through the CPU. But when a document arrives outside of my computer into the printer, it isn't just because, well, you know, that's what computers do. And this one happened to have a bit balance in it that produced a document. Well, I mean, I'm certainly not going to deny that the manipulation of the bits inside of the computer are very responsible in a very, it played a significant role in why it is that that document now exists and why it was able to be printed. But I think there's a little bit more behind the scenes to the story as to where that document came from and why there's this program that actually functions at my will and whim as a word processor. So I'm not denying the biochemical connection to depression. I'm just saying that's only the superficial story because the biochemical condition is the depression as understood from the organic aspect of what you are as an organism versus the experience you are consciously having as an organism. And so I'm suggesting that people need to go deeper. Modern science doesn't go deeper with many people only because, well, there's a lot of money to be made just stopping where we did. Billions of dollars are spent on therapy and drugs, all to alleviate for us the pain that we are told will never go away unless we take the pill, and it's entirely explained by the chemical balance that our brain happens to be in. I, I, um, I'm not suggesting that the solution is easy. I'm not. I'm even willing to admit that for some people, that solution may never be found, and this might be their permanent condition. That's possible, but I am saying that there's something that brought about that as being their chemical balance, and it's a long history. It has a lot to do with their development, and in many cases, it's a very treacherous and horrible story.
You know, you had this discussion, and several people became upset. I mean, they
Yeah,
were
they did.
pushing
And,
back,
you
not
know,
just,
I mean, if they
you know,
think I'm trying to rip something from
they
them
were
or
not
blame
pushing
them
back
or
with
something, which I
just
wasn't doing, I can understand why they'd be upset. We all seem to have this need to protect, you know, that which has become our identity.
right. if you would disclose not people, but could you disclose a bit of their pushback and answer and give a response to that? Because you did that in writing. I don't want you to tie up all the time reading all of it, but you
Mhm.
remember a lot of the pushback, and I want you to respond to that pushback. And so, if you don't mind, I would like for you to put on the table, what was said. That is, I mean, some people were saying, wow, this is crazy.
Yeah.
Bob, you can't be
Um,
right. You can't be
there
right. And
was,
so, go for it.
yeah, there were some people who thought I was, first of all, denying the medical science discovery that biochemistry has something to do with it. I was not denying that biochemistry has anything to do with it. I was just denying that that's the explanation for it. Anymore like when I said, the bits inside of a computer are the explanation for why the document appeared at the printer. There's more to it than that. Sorry, I had to move my camera here for a moment, but anyhow, so you know, there were some people who were worried about that, who thought that maybe I was, in denial of all of that, and I certainly wasn't. Uh, and there's some people who thought that I was blaming the victim, the person who's, because they must have made life choices. Um, and as if so, it's your own fault. You're depressed because, well, you chose this. Now, we certainly don't get anywhere by blaming the victim or giving them any more of a burden. But I think that some of these people don't realize what is the burden they're giving to people by telling them, no, this is just the natural state of you as an organism, and this is your reality, and this is you, and this is just the way it's going to be. um, I think they haven't stopped to think of just how cruel that story might be if it's not a true one. The other thing is, I would actually argue that ever since big bucks entered into uh, corporate science, that corporate science is no longer the kind of credible science that we regard it, and as a result, to disagree with some of the things that are being said or inferred from the data is not a rejection of science, but it is definitely a rejection of some of the things that many scientists are saying. Certainly not all. I mean, I remember back in the late '60s. I remember Congress was having all those hearings where they brought in various different scientists from the tobacco industry, and they're denying that there's any scientific evidence that cigarette smoking is harmful and what have you. And these people were, scientists with real degrees doing real research. And so, I mean, let's be honest. Science, I think, is extremely credible. It's one of the best methodological research methods. The research methods that we've developed in various scientific disciplines. Excellent, excellent stuff. It's really been great for. But that's not to say that the conclusions they draw are always without opportunistic agendas.
I'm getting some private messages from people on Facebook who have glanced at the show. I don't know that they are actually watching live, but they saw some of the comments being made. Uh, here's one question that was posed to me privately. I've been taking antidepressants for a long, long time. It's not doing me any good. Um, what should I do? Not asking for uh, so much for a professional response to the question, but just looking for some solutions. As a life coach, what could you suggest?
Well, for one thing, if you have a broken leg, I really believe that it's quite possible and quite likely that that can heal. But just because it can doesn't mean, well, just hold out and then eventually it'll heal. You're going to need to go see a doctor. You might need to wear a cast for a while. You might need to walk on a crutch. If you're suffering from severe depression, you may find it extremely useful to talk this through with a therapist. You know, that can help a great deal. It might even help you unravel the issues that underlie what's going on. There may be, for some people, the necessary step of actually going to some of the pharmacological drugs. But be aware of the fact that for the vast majority of people, those drugs merely reduce the symptoms temporarily. Then you have to up the dose, and then it only works temporarily. And if there's one thing that is true more often than not with people who are on medicine, they're still depressed. And those are helpful measures. Much like if you've got a fire, you need to put the fire out. But before you move back in the house, there may be some repairs you need to do, and particularly you need to find out what caused the fire. You don't want to be walking back into a fire trap after the fire is out. So I'm not suggesting that anyone should do anything different than the sorts of things that people are doing. But I am suggesting that there's a great deal of hard work that you may have to go through to try to figure out what sort of perspectives and experiences that you went through and the developmental effect they had on you to bring you to the point where this is your biochemistry. And I don't believe that it is necessarily the result of, well, this is just who you are genetically. This is particularly true in light of the fact that there are a lot of mental diseases that we experience in this day that are far more common than they used to be, and also don't exist in non-industrialized societies. By the way, there's a much criticized, and I think some of the criticism is valid, but a lot of it is absolutely invalid. There's a lot of criticism of a study that was done back in, I think, the 80s in Canada. It was in the early 1900s that a study was done with various rats. And this study that was done with rats put some of these rats into a cage, and these rats had access to a certain amount of food, and they also had access to two different bottles of water. One that was just standard water, and then the other one was a heroin infused water. These rats died within 80 days because they ended up hallucinating and just taking the heroin, much to the detriment of their own lives. And so this was suggested that their depression or their addiction and all that was due to the fact that they would choose all of that heroin over the water and the food. Well, usually a scientist, when they do a test, they want to make sure that they're isolating all of the variables. But sometimes the isolation from various variables is the variable you can't isolate. In other words, when we live our lives in the context of the whole shebang. We don't live our lives in just a single environment with a single stimulus to observe a single outcome and response to that single. No, we live our lives in the daily routine of all sorts of things. So the scientists in the late in the 80s thought, well, wait a minute, we look at those tests that show that these rats became addicted. How do we know it's the heroin? Maybe it's the cage. And so they did a test where they created something called a rat park. Beautiful park, and just the most wonderful environment in which a rat could possibly live. And in this rat park was also an access to water, and also heroin infused water. And these rats would imbibe in the heroin some, but they they didn't they didn't get addicted to it. So the cage seemed to be a significant difference. Now, the uh, the study has been criticized by many, but very few people have actually done what you really need to do with a criticized study, and that is this: if you think there's something wrong with the study, you can't just criticize it with the methods you think that were used. You have to repeat the study and demonstrate that you have controlled the variables and you can show exactly what was wrong with the study. You can't just make the claims, you know. And so, but as it turns out, there have been a lot of studies that have been done that ended up being buried because they didn't produce the results that people wanted to have published. There wasn't money in it. So, I think that there is room, even in the world of science to wonder if we're really dealing with some of the correct stories and explanations for some of the psychological phenomena we go through. And I think that unfortunately, mental health is a multi-billion-dollar business, and unfortunately, when it becomes that kind of a business, the people involved in it, um, without even really necessarily thinking of it, are certainly not interested in doing something that would eliminate their jobs. You know, so I think there's room for questioning the story. You know, and asking, is that all there is? Isn't there more to the story than what we're being told? And don't we actually really know that? Haven't we found that to be true? And so I think there's not only room but a moral imperative for looking at it far more deeply.
Now, you said my argument is that the current theories, and I'm talking about the argument that you made on Facebook. You said my argument is that the current theories that are popular in America only go as far with the data to derive financially beneficial assessment. But if we go deeper into the chain of events, we discover that it's rooted in a different multiplex of events and developmental processes. The current science is both flawed and in method and in being too shallow in scope. So, drill down a bit more with that, if you would.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's more than one way to lie. the, the worst way to lie, if you're a bad liar, you tell people things that are not only not true but obviously not true, and where they can just do a simple matter of fact checking, and wham, there you go. um, a little more clever lie is where you tell things that are true and mix it with things that are not true, and maybe a little bit ambiguous, and with a bias in the interpretation, and you just might get away with it. But the best way to lie is to tell the truth, but explain why the truth is the truth with a lie. And that way, when they check to see if the data that you're offering them to bolster your story is true, they look at it and they find out, oh, you're absolutely right. uh, hmm, must be you're right. And it is amazing how many people lack the critical thinking skills to say, well, wait a minute, is that the conclusion the data really requires of us? Or is that just one of the conclusions you can come to? If there's one thing that has been demonstrated in the world of science ever since we've used statistical analysis as a tool in research, and that is that there's the most common mistake that researchers make is they equate correlation with causation. And even though I've studied research methods in a linguistics department. I've studied research methods in a psychology department. I've taken courses on research methods in sociology, and I also took a course on statistical analysis in a mathematics department. And I can tell you that in order to properly claim that you found a cause and event, and by the way, I've also taken courses in philosophy that demonstrate the serious difficulty and problem philosophically of asserting that we actually can tell cause and effect exists. We seem to know that it does, but when we try to nail it down empirically or demonstrably, we find that it is not as simple a thing as you might think. And there are actually numerous causes for why two data sets might actually be highly correlated, and causation is only one of the several. And if you want to actually then start taking the data and the correlation and draw a conclusion from it, you have the extra burden of trying to eliminate all of the possible causes for high correlation before you settle on one of them. And if there's one thing that has the most common error made ever since statistics became a research method thing, was that you know you you this business of assuming that the correlation is one of cause and effect, and then just running with the story. And that's constantly being done. And I think that this is part of that is particularly advantageous if you can draw a story, come up with a solution to the problem as you've defined it, and you've never really proven that the story you've told is the only standing explanation for a high correlation.
I've enjoyed this very, very much. What are your thoughts on this, Darryl?
Well, I really can't appreciate the things that Bob has been saying. I'd like to add one thing. I think, other than just the monies involved in the selling of drugs and treating what I would think is more of a symptom than the actual treating the problem. And I think that that's where possibly another factor enters in. If a person is depressed and there's usually some circumstance or something, some reason behind it, whether it is really logical or sensical. But if it's not that, then they certainly need help in their reality possibly. But if it's a real circumstance that is a circumstance that possibly most people would have a hard time dealing with, then if we can just get them doped up, so to speak, then the problem goes away. But does the problem really go away? And I think it points to a greater need, and that is for uh, people to, well, it gets back to what we talk about so much here, being empathetic, people being empathetic toward other people's situations to the point to where uh, we are actually looking for ways to help people out of situations that cause them to be depressed
Right.
rather than just treat them for the depression.
Yeah, and now let's compare again the cage and the rat park with each other, and
Yeah.
to understand what's going on here. Now, are we going to blame the rat in the cage for deciding that its life seems to be meaningless and it might as well medicate itself with that which relieves its pain? That's the same thing as blaming the person who's depressed for their depression. I've shared this
Yeah.
story before, and I've shared it recently with other people. Um, and that is this, that I was raised in a family where it wasn't for me a very positive experience. And as a young adult, I was highly dysfunctional and very depressed, extremely suicidal, and all this other stuff. And there was a time, and it was the late '70s, early '80s. I'm sitting in a therapist's office, and went through a ranting rave where I was complaining about the things my parents had done and what they had said and the impact that it had on me, and why I was struggling so much to function in the world, to maintain my relationships with others in a positive, productive, and mature manner. And I was just having this fit of anger. And the guy that I was talking to, after I was all done, said to me something that hit me like a ton of bricks. He said, Bob, I'm not going to tell you that your parents did a good job. They didn't. And I'm not going to blame you for the fact that while you're growing up in that home, that you processed the things that were happening to you in a manner that made you believe there are certain things true about you. But I want you to know something that you've got to understand. There's nothing your parents ever said or did to you that did the damage until you believed it said something about you. And then you're just a child. How could you possibly know that it's a lie? But you go through your developmental phases of life. You go through the various different stages of growing up with this false belief about yourself that you have embraced. You're the one who embraced the idea that these actually said something about you instead of the fact that it says something about your parents. Now, I have seven. There's seven of us in the family, seven siblings. One of my sisters, she recalls at a young age of around 8, saying to herself, "My parents are effing crazy, and I can't wait to get out of here." She grew up believing that all of the things being done and said didn't say a damn thing about her, and that she was being raised by people who had no business having children under their care. Now, um, she went on to function just fine. But I really, the criticisms that I got and made sense to me. And I really thought, well, I must be inept. I must be a stupid idiot. I must be, there was merit in the criticism. It just never occurred to me that, they never noticed anything I do right, you know? Um, and of course, being the only boy at the time, I didn't have a brother until I was 13. Um, my mom was such a radical feminist at the time that I knew very well that I was destined to grow up to become the enemy. The sisters weren't, but you know, this caused me to embrace an idea about myself that explained the suffering I was going through as being attributable to my own inadequacy to life. And so I became an adult thoroughly convinced that I was inept, inadequate, incapable of functioning. And of course, I lived up to that perception of myself, and was very full of anxiety and depression, all that. And I did. I was on imipramine for a while, and Elavil and stuff like that. But it wasn't until I began going through a 5-year process of reviewing the humiliating experiences of my youth and really seriously questioning whether or not that said anything about me or what it does say about me for real, reliving many of those experiences, feeling the feelings that I felt, thinking about whether or not this is really an accurate way of thinking or feeling or interpreting the circumstance and understanding it. It took me 5 years of sometimes reliving some of those humiliating experiences, 10, 12, 15, 20 times, and going through dozens of different humiliating experiences that demoralized me as a person. By the time I came out of that, and I did this on my own by meditating and going through relaxation exercises. After 5 years of doing that, I came out of that 5-year period as a person who almost as if I had a completely different childhood. And that's what I didn't have any idea that that's what it was going to result in, but it did. Next thing you know, I'm functioning just fine, responding to the challenges of life in a far more highly adequate way. Not being perfect, but certainly finding my way around, and it changed, and I had to realize that, I think I hit the major vein here, and I started mining the gold that was coming out of that.
That's excellent.
I tell you what, I think so many people simply need to hear, your experiences here and your research here. I think it's been a wonderful show.
And I
Go
share
for
that
it.
experience, but sometimes there are some people who thought I was sharing that experience because I'm looking for sympathy. I'm not. I'm just fine. I'm 66 now. I came to a new discovery of truly liking myself by the time I was 40 years of age, and so I've had a good 26 years since then of loving life,
Good.
liking me, finding myself adequate to the challenges, some of them quite difficult, and in the context of that, enjoying the relationships that I have, the people in my life, and so I share that story not because I'm looking for sympathy. I don't need it. The healing has been rather significant and complete. But the reason I share this story is I want people who can say, I can relate to that story or what you're talking about, what happened, to let them know that there's hope. And also, I can't tell you how many people I've ever spoken to who who are struggling with self-loathing and self-hating and viewing themselves as inadequate to life, inept, a piece of garbage, trash, crap. People who look so lowly, their view of themselves is so damaged, and they don't see any connection between the way they feel about themselves and the horror stories they can share with me about how they grew up. And yet we already know from as early as Freud and Erik Erikson and Piaget that we as human beings, we go through various different stages of development in our lives, and the success of certain stages in that sequence depend upon the success and adequacy of completion of previous stages. And these are part of what build our sense of self and our sense of life and our sense of what reality is. Gives us a sense of who we are or what we deserve or where our niche in life is. This is all a part of that development, and it's very complex. And if it goes wrong, straightening it out is not easy.
Right.
And so, but what I want people to know is that, there's a pathway of hope. And this is not your lot in life. Now, I'm not one of these people who think you're a blank slate, that you can change everything and anything or be anything you want to be. I tell my students sometimes, you can't be anything you want to be in life, but you can be far more successful than you ever dreamed simply by discovering who you can be. And then sometimes I have to add a little joke, a little story that isn't true. I tell them, my mom stopped telling me that I could be anything I wanted to be after I got arrested for identity theft. uh, but you are constrained by the reality of who and what you are as an organism. You are constrained by the aptitudes and skill set that are within the domain of possibilities for the particular DNA you're born with. But the open-endedness of the plasticity of the damage is unknown. And I guarantee you that if you've been through some very demoralizing experiences that were significant in the process of developing, this has had some sort of an impact on your false sense of who you are and your false sense of how life works and your false sense of your lot in life and all that other stuff. And it is possible to rework some of that. Now, to be honest, we know this about developmental problems, that some developmental problems you can completely recover from. Some developmental problems you can only recover from partially. And there will be some developmental problems that the hardwiring is done and it cannot be repaired. And that's sadly the truth. But we don't know everything about what fits into what category. And we also know that some people can suffer certain problems because they arrived at that problem through slightly different pathways, so that we never know just who's going to be completely recoverable and who can just make some significant improvements.
Bob, this has been more than just good. Thank you so much for your time
Oh, you're
tonight.
welcome.
Yeah. Darryl, I'm going to ask
Yeah.
of you to sing us out of here because you always have that wonderful voice, the right song at the right time. Sing us out of here.
Hmm. Well, you like to put me on the spot, don't you?
Yeah.
The problem is, and this is kind of scary, but I've been enjoying a little Roy Orbison lately, and there's a song that he sings that actually is somewhat applicable to me, and I'm afraid I'm going to attempt it, and that's a scary thought. But I'm just going to try to do this one line. The song is "Running Scared,"
Mm.
and I'll see what I can do with it. I don't know. Uh, then all at once he was standing there, so full sure of himself, his head in the air. My heart was breaking. Which one would it be? You turned around and walked away with me. I
Awesome.
love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's excellent. Hey, thanks, guys, for doing this show. This was fun. This was
Sure.
fun. Okay, the curtain has been closed and it's already been sent to the